makes Mansfield Park so different from other novels by Jane Austen? It's pretty much universally acknowledged that Mansfield Park is a difficult book for a lot of modern readers. When people like Jane Austen, generally they like Pride and Prejudice, maybe also Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, and so on. But Mansfield Park is somehow difficult to like. In this video, I want to dig into why I think that might be and why I personally kinda like it anyway. First and foremost, before I get into all of the other reasons that I think Mansfield Park is generally not well loved in the modern day, there's a big cultural difference between Regency England and our 21st century world. In the society where Mansfield Park took place, it was considered okay to marry your first cousin, and the main character does. Many people, including myself, have a very, very hard time with this, and I think that if that were not the case, it might be an easier novel to appreciate. I kind of have to just set that aside and ignore it to appreciate some of the other things that I think make it quality literature, understanding, that we wouldn't consider that appropriate nowadays, but that they did it in Jane Austen's time, and so she put it in her novel. But it definitely is probably the number one thing that makes Mansfield Park very, very uncomfortable for modern readers. Another big thing that I think makes a difference is the main character's personality. Now, the protagonists of Jane Austen's novels have a variety of personalities, ranging from bold, outspoken, headstrong girls, all the way to quiet, reserved, and kind-hearted. As we saw with the recent Netflix adaptation of Persuasion, the latter doesn't always appeal to modern audiences, and so it often gets adapted out. The difference between Anne Elliot's personality in the novel Persuasion versus the 2020 movie, it's huge. It's one of the biggest changes that was made, and there were a lot of changes made. The same thing actually happened with Fanny from Mansfield Park in the 1999 movie version. Similar plot to the novel, just a completely different main character. Personally, I tend to be more of an introvert in my personal life. You might not think that based on the fact that I post videos twice a week on YouTube. You've got to be an extrovert, right? To talk to anybody who happens to watch something on the internet. But in my personal life, I'd rather be at home reading a book or doing some creative writing or watching a movie as opposed to going out to big parties or socializing with a lot of people. So I actually tend to like it when I find fictional characters that share my more introverted tendencies. And I was kind of offended by the Netflix Persuasion adaptation basically saying that a woman who's gentle and reserved doesn't make a good protagonist. Fanny from Mansfield Park is even more to the extreme than Anne from Persuasion. She's not only introverted, although I would say that she is also incredibly, what's the right word? A stick in the mud, maybe? She has very high moral standards, and she refuses to compromise on them for any reason. In fact, I kind of object to the characterization that sometimes people have of Fanny being a doormat, because she's really not. When she believes that something is wrong, she refuses to participate and makes a big fuss about it, even if it's something as simple as putting on a play. And that's not even getting into her refusal to marry someone that she doesn't have any feelings for and doesn't think is a particularly good person. The fact that she is someone who would think that putting on a play in the privacy of your own home is morally wrong and something that one must distance themselves from at all costs is not something that a lot of people today can relate to, because we don't generally see acting in plays as something that has any bearing on one's moral character. In day-to-day life, when it comes to her own preferences, wants, needs, and so on and so forth, she kind of is a doormat. She doesn't really stand up for herself. She lets herself be pushed around. I think that a lot of that comes from being raised by the Bertrams, who are her mother's relatives but not her immediate family, and who make it clear that they view her very differently than they do their own children. I actually think that her personality is very interesting in the way that it seems to be shaped by her life experiences and her firm desire to do the right thing and be a good person, despite being raised by a family that they're not always very good people. But she's not as immediately relatable as someone like Elizabeth Bennet or Catherine Morland or even Eleanor Dashwood. Likewise, her love interest is not that appealing. Now, granted, he's not the only flat, uninteresting, or unappealing love interest in Jane Austen's work. Personally, for instance, I'm not a big fan of Colonel Brandon, and I think that Charles Bingley is a bit too two-dimensional to be really a very interesting character. But with Edmund, it goes beyond that. For one thing, he spends the entire novel pretty much having feelings for and pursuing someone else, their neighbor Mary Crawford. He's the nicest of the family to her, but even he doesn't really seem to appreciate her or to really think very much of her. He's kind, and they seem to get along and be kind of kindred spirits, but at the same time, I mean, the whole thing with him borrowing her horse for Mary, for instance, and not understanding how important it was to her to be able to go out riding and that she didn't have the self-confidence to speak up when she wasn't okay with what was happening. So for a variety of reasons, it's very hard to get on board with that as the central romance. But in my opinion, the alternative isn't any better. I don't think that either Edmund and Mary or Fanny and Henry would make good couples either. Mary was just too dismissive of Edmund's hopes and dreams for the future. She wanted to see him pick a different career because she didn't want to be the wife of a clergyman, whereas he so clearly wanted to be a clergyman. Does that not provide a hint that maybe y'all aren't meant for each other? And then with Henry, I got the feeling that while his initial intentions toward Fanny did become more honorable over time, and he did develop feelings for her, I also got the impression that he didn't really value her that much as a person, more as a prize to be won. And I seriously doubt, given how different their personalities and values are, that they would have been happy together in the long run. So really, on the romance front, there is nothing in Mansfield Park that's worth getting excited about. And while Jane Austen isn't only about the romance, there's often a lot else going on. There's social commentary, there's sibling dynamics, and so on and so forth. The romance does play a big part in it, and I don't think it's surprising that people prefer things like Persuasion or Pride and Prejudice that have really strong, compelling romantic relationships at the core of them, over something like Mansfield Park, which is centered primarily around courtship and romance, but that doesn't give you a couple to really root for. Another big difference is the families at the center of the stories. Now, there are a lot of flawed and even dysfunctional families in Jane Austen's work. The Bennets, the Dashwoods, the Tilneys, the Woodhouses, none of those families are perfect in any way, but they do have some likable people in the family, and generally they don't come across as quite as dysfunctional as the Bertrams. The only family of one of the main characters that I can think of that comes close is the Elliots from Persuasion, where Anne is really the only likable character in the family. I suppose also Edward Ferras's family from Sense and Sensibility is pretty difficult to like, but we spend more of our time with the Dashwoods, so they're an obstacle to be overcome and not a main focus of the story. And then, finally, the overall tone of Mansfield Park is very different from any of the others, aside from maybe Persuasion. A lot of Jane Austen's novels, while they do have some substance to them, they're very lighthearted, humorous, and optimistic. That's not the case with Mansfield Park. Overall, it's a very serious story, tackling dark and depressing themes, with not very many likable characters. It does have what's meant to be a happy ending, but one that, as I mentioned before, a lot of modern readers might find it difficult to root for. Personally, I think Mansfield Park is very interesting, and I'm glad that I've read it. I tend to not be put off by dark elements in fiction. I've read Les Miserables multiple times for fun. I've read a lot of Shakespeare's tragedies, so I guess Mansfield Park doesn't really compare to stuff like that. And while I don't think that any of the characters are people I'd like to be friends with in real life, I do think that a lot of them are fairly interesting as characters. However, it's a novel that demands to be read in a very different way than one would read something like Pride and Prejudice, for instance. And because of how different it is from Jane Austen's other work, both in terms of the overall tone, the likability of the main characters, the central romance, and whether it's something that you can really get excited about, and just the types of themes and subject matter being explored, I think that it makes total sense that it might be off-putting to people who have enjoyed her other work. It's definitely not my favorite either, even though I did appreciate some things about it. Have you read Mansfield Park? What are your thoughts on it? Feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you'd like to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays.